You have to get your headphones in.
How come you don't want to talk about, well, I think there are several unbelievably gross things. The thing that teachers don't have to pass an 8th grade level test anymore.
Sometimes Bill complains that there's too much weight pulling down on him, on his ears.
Yeah,
so
I do complain that sometimes.
Or for him to kind of just hold your lap at the same time. So
I also think the Ray Donovan case is incredibly significant. The guy was U.S. Secretary of Labor under Reagan.
maybe they're in the wrong
He
ears.
tried to liberalize labor law. They threw the Democratic areas threw all kinds of charges against him, were totally bogus. And he had to resign, and he never recovered his reputation. Even his obituary in the New York Times said resigned under a cloud instead of saying resigned after exoneration or something, or resigned.
Probably just kind of hold this so it doesn't fall down too far.
Exonerated.
Just wrap it. I don't know. I know. Just wrap it around like this.
Okay. So you took it out of my ear.
I honestly have to say that the miscellaneous grab bag.
It's not there. It's gone.
Graham.
Graham's gone, but I'm listening, Bill.
Well, the miscellaneous grab bag is much more interesting and unique to us than 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are not. And we have nothing interesting to say about inflation right now. I don't.
Sure you do. It's going up.
I know, but what are we going to say that's different?
I don't disagree. I think the inflation is the weakest. It's very important, but it's
well,
we don't have the numbers yet.
Yeah,
I do think it's important. I think it's important, and I see why David had initially added it to the topic sheet, because it is something that
it's
differentiates. But it differentiates the Biden administration from the Trump administration, and
right.
A conservative administration from a Democrat administration that doesn't care about the repercussions in a few years.
And I think we can mention it in passing. If we're going to talk about taxes, we could certainly throw it in. But
I don't see why we're not talking about the global minimum tax. All the stuff in the miscellaneous is more interesting. The front page expose of internal problems in the ACLU, that's interesting.
Well, you can go there. That's why I put it on the grab bag.
Okay, while you were gone, Graham,
yes, sir.
David and I voiced that inflation should be way downgraded as a topic.
Okay.
But mentioned.
Okay. Got it. Can do that.
Now, I'd like to hear some thoughts on the number 5. Who?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's throw out Pennsylvania. We don't really care about that.
Right.
I think forbidding, well, I'm just saying if we had to pick a few of the miscellaneous, the forbidding online learning, I think that's interesting. The Democrat and Republican unity on industrial policy in the name of mercantilistically countering China, that's actually interesting. The global minimum tax, that's actually an interesting thing. We have the fact that that the liberals are covering, the New York Times is covering the split in the ACLU, and they also had a column today by Michelle Goldberg on the topic. It's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's premature to talk about the ban on sporting rifles and the federal judge in California.
Mm-hmm.
I think the federal aid thing is pretty important. The foreign aid, that's going to be their whole immigration policy, is foreign aid. And it's proven not to work on the front page of the New York Times.
I don't want to spend time talking about Ray Donovan, although it's a very important point.
Okay. Except we can do the racial quotas and school discipline later. I think that letting teachers, prospective teachers who can't pass an 8th grade level competency test off the hook is outrageous. It says recording in process. It's a little early for that, isn't it?
My sound keeps
Paul
cutting
turned
out.
on the returning,
Okay.
recording, not the returning.
This thing about California considers ban on construction in fire risky areas. That's premature. That will come up later too.
Bill,
Yes,
can you back up from the camera
I
some?
will. I will. I was
And
getting
we-
excited. I was getting excited. That's.
And move
my
it an inch or two to your left, please. Okay, that's better. Okay. Thanks. Bill looks kind of bright still. Let me go up there.
Hey guys, thanks for checking in.
Hey, Robert.
All the platforms are good to go on the simulcast. Looking forward to this, guys. Hope you guys are well.
Thank you for your continuous help. You know, this is our 20th episode.
Oh, is it really? Are you guys celebrating afterwards? You got
All
drinks
night
on the
long.
calendar?
Graham said to wait to 25 to celebrate.
I thought
Okay,
25 would
fair
be a
enough.
bigger date, but
Yeah, when I
still,
turn 21, I'll celebrate it.
I like it.
I was having trouble with my headset. You said something, Bill, about grab bag issues on refugee aid. I said I don't want to do Ray Donovan, but I will turn to you to make a few comments on these, depending on how we're going.
Okay, so the ones that I thought were important were forbidding online learning,
Mm-hmm.
industrial policy, global minimum tax, ACLU.
Yeah. Well,
Foreign
those are
aid,
big.
foreign aid, and letting teachers that can't pass 8th grade competency tests off the hook. Well, you can't get to all of those, but I just think,
The first few, except for Pennsylvania, right?
yeah, get rid of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I mean, it's important, but you can't do everything.
Okay, I will do my best here to try and move us from subject to subject, but at least we have an order
We
or
have enough.
sequence. We have a sequence to follow.
And we
also.
have enough.
Okay,
Oh, we have more than enough.
Right, I'm logging
Graham.
off. We'll send the questions to Robert.
Graham,
Hey,
could you
everyone.
start your
Good,
quick time
thanks.
recording?
Yes.
Okay, don't forget to smile. And Graham, your name says Independent Institute. It doesn't
Oh,
say.
I already, Paul restarted me. I forgot. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
bye everyone. Smile. Good. Bye-bye.
Thank you. We need you.
To the order. Fauci is always number one.
I don't think the names show up in the live stream.
No, but anyway.
You changing yours, Graham?
I am.
See that chair behind me?
Yes.
Director Paul, it says.
Oh, what fun.
Yep, it's good.
Well, you shouldn't be allowed to sit in a movable chair. You should have to sit in a canvas backed theater chair.
He has one of those too somewhere.
Well, that green in the background is canvas back, isn't it, Paul?
That's right.
That is
That's it.
Yeah, it's a director chair. Yeah.
That's it.
Bill, can you
Okay.
move an inch to your left and a little closer to the camera, please?
Okay, but that's what you
And
told
no-
me already.
And no leaning back. We don't want you to fall back.
It would add drop.
It would, but we don't lose you.
Jonathan, can you hear me? Would you mind calling Anna? Reminding her?
Surely
Thank
she
you.
wouldn't forget.
She's a busy girl.
Is she in Southern California now or?
Yeah, she's at some kind of Republican meeting. I don't know if
Uh-huh.
she's still there or not.
I think David provided us this great piece from the Washington Post on the so-called vexing lab leak theory? Or was that from Bill?
No, oh, yeah.
Really, it's almost 2 weeks old, but it's a really good piece in the sense that it provides a very sophisticated defense of the mainstream media, but it actually falls totally flat.
Yep.
But boy,
That's
they
right.
tried really hard to justify their.
Today's Wall Street Journal says, or maybe it's not yet published in the physical journal, but the online version says 57,000 animals were slaughtered at the Wuhan wet market under completely unsanitary and
So
unhygienic
making that
conditions.
making that more
No,
plausible.
just saying,
Yeah.
just
Yeah, but-
saying, it's something to bear in mind.
Well, I have an article here that says that there were no bats or pangolins sold in the Wuhan wet market.
But lots of other things.
Other
Who
things.
knows?
Well,
We're about a
somebody
minute out.
knows, somebody knows, somebody knows.
Well, the issue wasn't whether that could ever happen. The issue was whether it was ridiculous to think that it could have been a lab leak. That was the issue. And it's clearly not
Where-
ridiculous.
We're
They
about,
need to, they need to explore everything.
That's right. And they weren't.
got about 45 seconds, guys.
And I'm going to pause for about 12 after
Yeah,
that.
there you go.
Okay, just as a reminder.
Exactly. Paul, is everything good to go on your end?
Yep, I think so.
Okay, excellent. All right, we're about 30 seconds out.
Sorry for clearing my throat, but I got to do it beforehand.
No, you're good. And 40 seconds. Excuse me, 20 seconds.
20. I was thinking, wow, time.
Yeah, it's I'm in command of quantum physics. I don't know if and 10 seconds. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're good to go.
Seems like everybody is changing their minds about the idea that COVID leaked from the Wuhan lab. Lots of people seem to have egg on their faces. And then on another subject, what about all this massive federal spending and planned tax increases and borrowing to pay for it all? And then again, what's the deal with all this talk about the 2020 vote audits and also about UFOs? Are both those subjects equally crazy, or is there maybe something more to the one than to the other? We'll talk about these subjects and more on this edition of the Independent Outlook. Greetings, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and we try and bring you an independent perspective on the issues of the day. Actually, I'm pleased to note that this is our 20th broadcast, and we're grateful to all our friends who've joined in, especially to our friends over at thinkspot.com and all those who are listening in and participating through ThinkSpot. And of course, as always, I'm joined by my colleagues, David Theroux and Williamson Evers. David Theroux, president of the Independent Institute. Welcome today, David.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Pleasure to see you. Also, Williamson, Bill Evers. Hello, Bill. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's great to see both of you. And again, this is a lot of fun. I'm doing this 20th time. There's never a lack of things to talk about. In fact, sometimes the news seems to get crazier and crazier. It's actually still going on that people are talking about what really happened at the Wuhan lab and whether it was a mistake to have dismissed the idea of a lab leak, as was done so really vehemently last year. What's the latest on this, and why did the Biden administration shut down former Secretary of State Pompeo's probe into the leak? That puzzles me. Either of you have some thoughts on why the Pompeo investigation was shut down?
I think it was for political reasons that would have been set in motion by the Trump administration. And not only that, I think they were very worried by this passage in a memo that the Pompeo State Department put out. The United States has determined that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has collaborated on publications and secret projects with China's military. It has engaged in classified research on behalf of the Chinese military since at least 2017. So that
Wow.
was the current thinking of Pompeo as he was going out the door.
That was the January 15 information, correct? If I recall.
That was
Just-
a January 15 memo. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Exactly. And so had they allowed the investigation to continue, there might have built a bigger mountain of evidence on behalf of that, and that would have been embarrassing. Is that why it was
Well,
therefore stopped?
Perhaps they thought that that wasn't the case, or it wasn't important to the. There's also, of course, the question of a conflict of interest. Some of the people making decisions in this had gone on record supporting this kind of chimera type of virology research.
Mhm.
And it was going on in various places and at various times. And some US money. So let's say you give American taxpayers money to a intermediary, and they give it to this Wuhan Institute, and it's supposedly to go collecting bat feces samples or something like that, or live bat samples. Okay, that goes into the main pot of the money for this institute. Now, you, the donor, the American bureaucrat, can say, well, I didn't pay for gain of function. I didn't pay for chimeras. I just paid for sample collection. But it goes into the big pot. And so, it's completely fungible. So a critic can say, oh, you say you didn't pay for it, but here they're doing it, and they're reaping tons of taxpayer money in order to do these projects. So it looked ugly. And so the best thing to do was see if time would render it irrelevant.
Well, the funny thing was that President Biden stopped the investigation that Pompeo started, but then he demanded his own from the intelligence community, so-called, within 90 days. David, I think you had a comment in here somewhere. I don't want to miss your comment on the subject, David.
Well, CNN claimed that the reason why it was dropped was because the quality of evidence in the investigation was lacking and was not credible. And it was basically, echoing the view that Trump is just making wild assertions for his own political reasons. And, but, clearly the intelligence agencies knew about this earlier. Commissioning a new 90-day study is just politics. And the project that Pompeo was pursuing was perfectly legitimate. And it's a political decision. And what Biden wants to try to duck is that Trump didn't know what he was doing. He was making wild assertions without evidence, but now we're going to get the facts. And we were misled before, but now it looks like this is the case. So they're basically trying to, it's like the vaccine issue. Biden's trying to claim credit for the vaccines. It's the same kind of a thing.
And I think we have to just recognize that this is not unique to the Democrats.
No.
Let's say it was a transition between the Biden and the Trump administration, and some
You
kind
mean
of
in reverse.
yeah. I'm just saying it wouldn't be crazy for the Trump people to want to restart something that was a problematic or hot potato type thing, and make sure that the people doing the work felt they owed their appointment to the Trump administration. And maybe they're not going to distort things, but they'll give them a heads up earlier so they can be prepared and that sort of thing. That's kind of how the politics and bureaucracy work.
Right, but I think it's important to point out that the COVID pandemic was used for political reasons.
Absolutely.
And so this is again trying to position yourself
Yeah.
in a good position. And
It was being
Fauci
weaponized. That's right.
Fauci is the high priest of the COVID epidemic, shutdowns and all the rest of it, and his flip-flopping and denials and what have you. And
Certainly.
so Biden comes in and he promotes it. And
Certainly flip-flopping on mask wearing, flip-flopping on the numbers involved in herd immunity,
Yep.
flip-flopping on just so many things that seem like blowing in the wind.
virtually
for him.
everything. But I think the most key, the key part about Fauci, of course, is that he and Francis Collins were directly and intimately involved in changing the policy that was banned by the Obama administration about gain of function research funding and operations. And they funded a lab that they'd worked with for years in China, which had low standards of safety and had a direct contact to the Chinese military. Not just the Chinese military, but the Chinese propaganda entities. I mean, within the lab, there are all these stories or videos of scientists in meetings, basically re-education classes, and they're expressing their loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. So this is not top secret stuff, but they tried to paper it over and ignore it and claim that they were above the fray, when in reality they use this and they're still using it. And Americans have died, and American society has been changed in many substantial ways. Not to say it can't be restored in important ways, but the last year and a half, whatever, has been traumatic, and there's no one really being held accountable for it.
Did you notice this fascinating paper from Dr. Fauci that recently reemerged from 2012, where he was discussing the risks of this kind of virology research? And he asks rhetorically in this paper in 2012, what if the scientist becomes infected with the virus, which leads to an outbreak and ultimately triggers a pandemic? He goes on to say, scientists working in this field might say, as indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweigh the risks. That's Dr. Fauci in 2012. So he was quite aware of the risks. He himself had downplayed the risks. And so when the question arose as to whether the COVID virus had emerged from the lab where this research was taking place, when that question arose, you could see how you'd want to downplay that hypothesis if you had already stated publicly that you thought the risks were worth it. You wouldn't really want to do that. And I can see the pressure of that situation might have been tough to take.
I want to potentially, pretty funny here for me to be defending Dr. Fauci, but we're in danger of doing something like what was done with nuclear power after the meltdown. Suddenly nuclear power, which is an extremely safe thing, became liquidated. And, just because China did a bad job with safety protocols and Russia and Chernobyl did a bad job with safety protocols, doesn't mean that we should end virology research. These are very dangerous pathogens.
We need to understand them.
I think so. So we have to be, yes,
but the point here is that you're weaponizing.
There was a cover up.
There was a cover up.
There is a danger of military, germ warfare type situations here. But I don't think this should lead us to end virology research.
And no,
I don't think we're talking about that, Bill, but I think we are talking about weaponizing virology research to create basically pathogens that would create a worldwide pandemic of unbelievable proportions.
I am against germ warfare. The United States is in international treaties that forbid it. However, just speculating here and without firsthand knowledge, I do not doubt that the US is secretly doing germ warfare research.
Probably so. And I think that's the reason why Fauci, there are a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons why Fauci did not even mention any of this in all the meetings with at the White House and with the media and everybody else is because he wanted it to be a secret. Yeah. He wanted to be a secret because that's how they were pursuing it. And also he didn't want to be held accountable for it.
I think we should consider other topics.
Oh, we will in a minute, but just give me one more shot at another angle on this one, which I think is not what government agencies or actors were doing, but rather the question of how the media covered it. the whole question of downplaying the lab leak, last year. I really was absolutely fascinated by this piece in the Washington Post, a week and a half ago, roughly, by Aaron Blake, which seems to be a kind of, introspection on the part of the Washington Post, where they acknowledge here, a couple of phrases interesting. Washington Post says in this piece, it has become evident that some corners of the mainstream media overcorrected when it came to one particular theory from Trump and his allies, that the coronavirus emanated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. But then the argument is that they overcorrected, but they couldn't help it because they say Trump and his allies invited and deserved skepticism. And so President Trump's credibility, they say, was so low because he had been so irresponsible on other subjects that it was understandable for the mainstream media to poo-poo the assertion, which he seemed to be making, and others in his administration, that the virus could have leaked out of a lab. How could they help but downplay something that Trump was upplaying because Trump had been so irresponsible? Now, that's a really interesting argument. It has an element of truth to it. But I want to.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also the way this was handled was because of the Lancet article, and also the intelligence agencies claimed about at the same time that there is no evidence for the lab leak, the lab source story. And so it was basically using science as the cover, when in reality there was no science at all. I mean, there's no science at all that could defend the view that it was something that naturally evolved, and yet all the circumstantial evidence seemed to point, and they're talking about over a year ago, the evidence all pointed to a circumstantial case that the Wuhan lab was a source. And that was poo-pooed and ridiculed and so forth. But it also is in keeping with the fact that the elite culture is not based on the science. It's based on an ideology, somewhat imprecise in some respects, but otherwise dominant. And if things don't match and sustain that narrative, it's the enemy and it needs to be derided. Hence, we're the anointed ones to interpret things and to continue to rule. So when Biden comes in, of course, the first thing you have to do is you have to scrub all the things that were claimed or whatever, even if they were successful, and without even considering those things that were not successful, that were foolishly done during the Trump period. There's no assessment of what to do about that. I mean, it's just really amazing. It goes back to, in some respects, Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, why the worst get on top, and so forth. And in Fauci's case, what he's been saying on TV interviews is that I am science. I am science. And if you don't like it, you're not scientific. And whatever I say, and I can change my mind based on whatever I say. So I think that being questioned now is a very positive and encouraging sign.
I think that this mea culpa in the Post and other elite media is encouraging on that level, but also illuminating, because as I say, this piece in particular, which admits that there was overcorrection errors and so forth, that there was a mistake to call it debunked and so forth. The argument being,
Columbia Journalism Review has said something along the same lines.
Right. And what's happening, though, is that the people in the elite media, they fail to see that the elite media really have now been demonstrated to have exactly the same problem that they accused Trump of having, namely diminished credibility due to a political agenda and carelessness. Turns out that in this case, they're acknowledging that there was, a degree of a political agenda, but they couldn't help it because Trump had a political agenda. They were reacting to Trump's political agenda, or they were careless because Trump had been careless. And I suppose one could say this, that the only difference really between the mainstream media error and the Trump error is that the mainstream media use a much more sophisticated vocabulary and a much more modulated tone of voice to achieve their spin than Trump did. And I'm not really sure that a modulated, sophisticated sounding spin is really more admirable than a rough, coarse, and jibing kind of spin.
Well,
Both kinds of spins
there's
seem
another
bad.
dimension to it, Graham. And the other part of it is the mainstream is essentially an enabler of the Washington establishment, the swamp, the deep state, whatever you want. They're invested in it. They believe in it. Ideologically, they obviously benefit in many different ways. There's collusion and so on. There's a revolving door. Many of the top people in the mainstream media were in the Carter administration or whatever, Obama and so on. That's understandable, but I think there's a certain objective lesson to be learned about the nature of politics and political power and centralization of power and the way ideas are manipulated to stay in power and to attack enemies. And I think that one of the things that was very positive and sort of refreshing about the Trump period was that it wasn't a group of people, but not completely by any means, but it brought in a group of people who were not part of the swamp. And they were looking at it in a more independent way and could see the folly in it. And they were trying to make changes, and many of the changes were positive, others were not. But I think falling back to the machine politics that the Democratic Party really represents today, as far as Washington is concerned, is not to say the Republican Party doesn't have machines too, but the Tammany Hall kind of machine politics, which is really what Biden is about, it doesn't really represent any ideas. It's basically catering to the interest group.
It's an amalgamation of interest groups.
Right. There's an array of
Mhm.
interest groups,
Mhm.
and they want goodies and they want power, and they have their own agenda and so forth. And he caters to that. He's always done that.
So,
So I have another thought, and that is, and this ties in with later stories. It used to be that journalists not only would dig into stuff, but they would say one person says this and another person says that. But currently they seem to be leaping to say, and this second person is false, is a liar, is saying something that's been totally debunked, without having done an in-depth news analysis that shows that. So if you think back to the very early days of discussion of the lab leak versus the animal leap idea, I read maybe one or two stories trying to explain why the animal leak idea was correct. It had to do with the configuration of the molecules and so forth in the virus and how they attached and things like that. But some of the same stuff is going on now in terms of showing that the lab leak and design better explains the configuration of the molecules. There was a little bit of that, but it was not very present to people. Now, I know it's sort of boring and technical, but if you're going to lay down that the thing is debunked, is false, is a lie, you need at least one or two times in a prominent place to be explaining that. And we didn't see it.
We didn't see it, and it goes worse than that, Bill, because it wasn't just what you're saying, which is true, is that they had no interest and didn't even begin to look at the evidence. It was completely dismissed.
Right, and that's because
I think we're ready to move on.
We are indeed. But how about moving on to this news story? Speaking of the new approach to politics coming out of the Biden administration, President Biden was involved in some apparently protracted negotiations with Republican congressional leaders about stimulus spending and budget and so forth and taxes, and he decided to pull the plug on those negotiations. Senator Capito from West Virginia and others were involved.
This is the infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
And they've been here's the thing where both the Democrats and the Republicans could spend big money, right? And
Mhm.
lavish things on their own districts and all that sort of thing. So the Democrats just seem to want to do too much. They wanted to escape the normal meaning of infrastructure. They wanted to have programs that were training programs and not physical structures. They wanted to raise taxes in order to do it. They didn't want any user fees. They didn't want to take any of unspent COVID relief
They still
money.
want all that.
Right. They want to double down on all those things. And so that's why they broke off. However, they found a common core in spending industrial policy money on science, technology, biotech, supposedly in the name of rivalry with China. So now we're two
So
mercantilists.
Republicans can buy into that spending.
Right. That they were able to find common ground. And there are some people, Mike Lee, Ron Johnson, so forth, who said, no, this is a boondoggle. No, we're trying to turn the United States into the Chinese system in order to supposedly succeed in contradistinction to
Yeah,
China.
interesting argument, huh?
Yeah, I think that's a true argument.
Sometimes when the Republicans and Democrats get together and agree about spending more money, it kind of feels to me like an episode of Wheel of Fortune. Come on, big money, and they spin the wheel, and then they can agree on big money on a few categories.
They certainly did on this Endless Frontier Act. I call it the Endless Spending Act myself.
And for those of you who don't know basically how this act would be set up, the way it is set up primarily is that you have, and this is part and parcel with the tax proposals and other things, is that you raised the tax rate, you increase regulations, and then you offer to different businesses the opportunity to get subsidies if they will pursue their work in certain ways. So it's basically industrial policy.
Right.
And it's
picking winners, picking losers.
Picking winners, it's industrial policy. It's very much in keeping with the progressive tradition
It is.
of central planning, which is what is sometimes called corporatism.
Yeah.
And is what, taken to a certain extreme, is what Mussolini proposed.
That's right. But it certainly is corporate welfare, no matter.
It's corporate welfare on a
Well,
huge scale. That's right.
So with this massive degree of spending, if they can agree on it, necessitate more taxes and or more inflation?
Well, there's only so many different ways you can pay for things.
Right.
And, borrowing, eventually it's taxes of some sort. And inflation is a kind of tax because it decreases the value of the money people are holding.
Right.
So they're doing, they're trying all the different ways. They borrow a lot, including from Chinese. They tax and they inflate. And the question is, there's a lot of talk about how the inflation that we're seeing right now is just temporary and it's not going to be a problem. But many important economists say no. And Martin Wolf just had a column in the Financial Times of London saying, this looks very much like the 1970s. It's going to be they're keeping it loose for a long time into the future. And that's going to mean when they pull back, as Volcker did, it's going to have a violent dislocation.
Well, don't ever pull back.
Well, there's that. That's the
Problem
modern
solved.
That's the modern monetary theory that in caricature believes money grows on trees.
Or from helicopters.
Right. That's
Okay, so I think the summary here is pay attention, and let's just hope the American public pays enough attention not to let their various representatives find common ground always on spending more money.
well,
Because-
and as Larry Kudlow pointed out, the tax burden that the Biden people are proposing would mean the burden on Americans would be heavier than China's.
That's
Good
right.
grief.
Heavier than China and heavy. I mean, to Kudlow's credit, when he was in the White House, he was able to get through a measure that was adopted in the Congress to cut tax rates and the corporate tax and others. And that created a huge boom. And wages went up as a result, also with the deregulation and so on. And what Biden is proposing is to eliminate that and actually to raise taxes really across the board. And there's not enough money in the economy to pay for these trillions of dollars of debt. And this modern monetary theory view is crank economics.
Mhm.
So
And
there's another aspect to that, and that is the Biden people realize that all these proposals there are going to require, as we're talking about, is going to be inflation, borrowing, or tax.
Mhm.
And they're worried that the amount of tax they're going to impose will make the United States unattractive as a place to do business.
Mhm.
Right.
So the way to counter that is to make every place in the world an unattractive place
Mhm.
to do business, and then people will stay where they are. And that's this global minimum tax.
yes, and it's all
Not,
part.
not only is it full of tons of tiny language red tape
Yeah.
that will trap people, but it's going to definitely undermine American competitiveness, even though they're hoping that it won't
Yeah.
make it as bad as it otherwise would.
I don't think it's gonna happen, because I think the trend of things like Brexit and all the rest of it around the world are going to fight against it.
Yeah, in the opposite
And
direction.
I think that the public is massively more untrusting of Washington than ever before.
Yeah, but they've already got agreement in principle from
Yeah.
all these other top
Well,
industrial countries.
That's what they're trying to set up. But I think that there's no way it's going to be a global thing, is what
I
I'm
mean,
trying to
if
say. And I
they
think there'll
sec-
be a sufficient number of major places
Tax
that will not
havens.
go along with it, because
Right,
there's no
Yeah.
law that says they have to.
right.
Right.
And from a
exactly.
competitive tax standpoint, they're going to benefit.
But
Right.
just
So I
think if
think
they
it's gonna fall
succeeded,
apart.
and the Biden administration folks should be thinking about this, if they succeeded, what would that mean? Even if it can't succeed, but if it did, what would it mean for liberty of individuals around the world? So much for voting with your feet. There'd be absolutely no escape.
That's
Right,
right.
and-
That's their goal.
That's their goal.
actually.
That's right. And it's all part of the so-called Great Reset, where you have central planning, and it's for climate reasons, it's for equity reasons, it's for,
Oh,
You
right.
name it,
equity, yeah.
There's
it's all-
there's a panoply of reasons, but guess what? Some set of people end up with the power and the money.
that's right, exactly. And you
Okay.
end up with this ruling class. The ruling class has been steadily losing its standing in the United States.
Right, right.
And hence the rebellion with, the Trump movement, MAGA movement, whatever. And there are other aspects that reflect this too.
Yeah, I mean,
And so I think that what we're,
The Tea Party was a reflection of it.
absolutely, the Tea Party was a reflection of it. And I think that the audits that are spreading now in different states for the November 3rd election that's part of this. I think the placement of Fauci as the high priest of American science and governance is part of this. It's just going to, the problem with the cartel, as Adam Smith pointed out, is that a cartel is a bunch of competitors that get together because they think they have a mutual reason to raise prices, but they can only do it if they do it in sync.
elusively.
That's right. But since
But every
the actual
member has an incentive to
right,
chisel, to
Yeah.
hide under the table, not going along with the cartel.
since
So
the
that's
actual
why David thinks they will not hold together in their tax
Well,
cartel.
Hopefully.
right. I mean, and the bottom line for Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, essentially, I mean, his book was an attack on so-called mercantilism,
Right.
which was government royal privilege, monopoly privileges. So his
But
point is that
it's, you don't have to have royalty in order to have this, because this whole thing with industrial policy is China is already a mercantilist state. America is too much of a mercantilist state. But things like this China-related industrial policy makes us even more a full-fledged mercantilist corporate monopoly state type thing.
Right. So the point, getting back to Smith for a second, is that for all these competitors to stay in line, since the actual market price is lower than the monopoly price, as Bill said, there's enormous incentives to cheat behind the backs of the other cartel members. So the way you keep the cartel members in line is through policing. You have to force them in line. The mafia does it by breaking people's legs in the back alley. They can't do it in public. And the only way the government can get away with it in public is they put some sort of veneer that this is actually serving the people when actually it's ripping them off. But I think that the incentives are so huge to fight against this. And I think the credibility, i.e. this veneer that the government is claiming, is wearing thinner and thinner for people. This, the COVID was the big veneer in the last 16 to 18 months, and that's totally falling apart.
Right.
So
I think we should take up the topic you raised about the 2020 vote, various audits that are going on, various laws that are being proposed in the states, what the progressives' line is on the laws that are going on in the states.
Well, I want to make a comment on that as we start, because I'm just struck as we have this conversation about these parallels. I think David is implicitly saying the same thing, that with regard to the lab leak theory, it was floated way back when. People in the elite media said, not even worth pursuing because look who's floating it. Okay, so now skip to vote audits. The wrong people are suggesting that we need vote audits, so don't even pursue it. Don't even do audits.
Right.
It just seems the same kind of like a reflex of deference to elite opinion. And elite opinion is just, it's not worth genuflecting automatically to elite opinion. I say, if there's a question about vote integrity, do the audits. I mean, find out, and then get things. If there's nothing
and try and do a professional job of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If it's a big nothing burger, you'll prove it's a big nothing burger. So wouldn't we all be better off then?
So I would say this, the best time to deal with problems of voting is before the vote.
Absolutely.
It's much harder to figure out what happened afterwards because you have a lot of electronic stuff. You have, people, it's a secret ballot. You don't have written names on each one and so forth. They call it an Australian ballot. So if you're an American firster, you should be against it. But anyway, that's a joke. We need to have, as was said by someone, a prophylactic approach. In other words, the laws the various voter integrity laws that are being proposed now, signature matching, thumbprints, voting in person, no voter harvesting, all these different ideas are good because they mean you don't have the doubt afterwards because the process was done as close to being right as possible. We also know for sure that Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin did things that were really unconstitutional. Wisconsin changed the law, just voting officials changed the law.
When you say unconstitutional, you mean in violation of Wisconsin's state constitution?
No, he's talking about in violation of the US Constitution.
Yeah.
The US Constitution very specifically stipulates that election laws on the state level have to be adopted by state legislatures and no one else. The governor, the attorney general, some commissioner, they have
that's exactly right.
So here's what Rand Paul says. I think he's pretty accurate on this. In Wisconsin, tens of thousands of absentee votes had only the name on them and no address.
Yeah.
The name is on the envelope, not on the vote itself. Historically, all such votes were thrown out. This time, they dismissed this concern that had previously been the rule. And that to make this change after the fact, ex post facto, without legislative, that's unconstitutional. You can't be doing that. And in Pennsylvania, officials made it, not the legislature. So it was done in the name of COVID panic and all, but it all had one tendency, to not scrutinize, to not carefully make sure that only eligible people were voting, and to make sure they weren't voting multiple times, and the other things that we're concerned about, that dead people weren't voting. We know there are documented instances of this. Now, do we now know that this overturns the election? I don't think we have the complete evidence for that, but for the journalists to say that this theory is debunked is missing the fact that no journalists of national stature have gone in and dug into what the amounts would really be.
Right.
So they're jumping the gun.
Bill, it's not only that, it's also that, I mean, what we're talking about is what a normal audit consists of, a so-called full forensic audit.
Right.
Okay. Now, the IRS does audits, and there are different types of audits. Full forensic audit is the most complete audit. And a business and whoever, that's what they face.
Independent Institute has its own
Absolutely.
internal audit. We have to,
Exactly.
if
Every
a check
year.
is written, we have to, who authorized the check? Did it
And
go
there's
to a genuine vendor? Any
And there are
good
objective
company,
standards that are
right,
used for that.
exactly.
Okay, so it turns out that there's never been a full forensic audit across the country ever in the United States of voting records. Never. There's never been, in other words, the people who claim
We don't
that there's no
want- we
evidence,
don't
that
want-
there's no
we don't
evidence
want
of
the national
fraud.
government to do it. We want
I'm not
state
saying
and
the
local.
national government.
I just wanted to clarify that for our
Okay, what I'm trying to say is that the people who say there's no evidence of voter fraud have no evidence that that's true. They have no evidence whatsoever. And yet all the circumstantial evidence, again, is pointing to the question of why were these voting procedures changed so there's no accountability? Well, in the history of voter fraud is full of these circumstances in which people could defraud voting. And countries around the world, in Europe and elsewhere, have faced the same problem, and they've adopted these measures, signatures and what have you,
Right.
that reduce the likelihood of it. So anyway, my point is, what's happening now is that in Maricopa County in Arizona is really the first full forensic audit ever done after an election in the history of the United States.
Wow.
And so what's happening now is that state legislators from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia and many other states are going to Maricopa County to go to a classroom discussion presentation, what they're doing. And then they have essentially a tour of how the whole thing was set up. And they're interested in adopting this in other states. So again, getting back to to Graham's point, is that don't we want to have legitimate, honest elections where people can have their vote counted? Of course we do. So what is the problem in having a full forensic audit all the time? Isn't that really the way to go? Or at least to eliminate those measures that the probability is high that fraud will occur. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So my, I don't want to downplay the idea of official audits, journalistic investigations.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. We should be for that. We want the facts out, but my stress is on fixing it going forward, because it's too hard to find out what happened, and it's definitely too hard to reverse an election once it's been certified.
Right, but
So
Bill,
I'm not saying we shouldn't look into it. I'm just saying
the advantage of
the people who are attacking these preventative laws and saying, oh, this is racial suppression and on, they are the ones that are the worst people in this situation. It's not some person who might be doing a sloppy audit or something. You should also pay attention to sloppiness in that. But the worst people are the ones that are trying to prevent these careful laws.
I think the good news in all of this is that if you look at the polls, it's like 70% of Republicans believe that there's major voter fraud, something like 35 to 40% of Democrats. And so that's a huge percentage of the public. And the way to start is to look at what happened and what should not have happened, and to adopt measures that will essentially enable accountability. The momentum usually in politics and governance is the squeaky wheel approach. If there's not enough attention to it, just let it go.
Right.
And so that's what people like Stacey Abrams and others have been counting on. They want to attack anybody who raises questions of being someone who's trying to do voter suppression and so on. And we don't want to change it. And HR 1, which fortunately looks like is not
would have covered all this up.
right, would essentially institutionalize all these different
Measures
measures that would
foster voter irregularity and fraud.
So I think that any way you look at it, quite frankly, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you don't believe there was voter fraud, if you do believe there's voter fraud, let's take a look at what there is,
Right.
and let's figure out how to eliminate it.
I think a lot of the reaction to this stems from a kind of irrational fear.
Yeah.
You hear this from people on all sides of the spectrum, but one big version of it as well. If we do voter audits and do the Maricopa County thing, then that's going to lead to some kind of Myanmar style, coup. We put Trump back in power. No, that's not the point in the slightest. The point is to find out, if you can, what went wrong so that you can prevent bad things like that happening in the future.
Bad things like irregularities, as
if there were any,
2020.
that's right. And so I think Senator Paul actually was just very exemplary in the comments. He said, for instance, Senator Rand Paul, I voted to certify the state electors because I think it would be wrong for Congress to overturn that. But at the same time, I'm not willing to sit here and say, oh, anybody on the Republican side is a liar and there's no fraud. No, there were lots of problems.
There have been many instances, including in the Senate, of election results that were determined that were fraudulent, and that person was replaced.
Right. So, but
in
this
it's not
case,
unprecedented. But I think the minimum point, I think we'd all agree on, is that the only way we're going to ensure election integrity is to eliminate these measures that induce fraudulent behavior, and people can get away with it.
Okay, I think we've covered this.
We have indeed. So let's just turn the corner. We were also intrigued by a number of other news items this week. For example, Bill Evers, you brought to my attention that both the mayor of New York and the governor of New Jersey are now forbidding online learning. What's the deal with that?
So here's the headline in the New York Times. New York City will eliminate remote learning for next school year. And here's the Trenton paper, the capital of New Jersey. New Jersey schools won't be allowed to offer any virtual learning options next year, Murphy says. Murphy is the governor of New Jersey. So the really interesting thing is, this is that the unions have always shied away from charter schools, even magnet schools, opportunity scholarship programs, tax credits, anything where parents have some kind of choice. Well, here's a situation where about 20% of the parents say, actually, my kid thrived under distance learning, virtual learning, whatever you want to call it, okay? And so, of course, that means 80% did not thrive, all right? But they're trying to crush an option for parents because they want one size fits all. This is the most convenient for the unions. They're not encouraged by the idea that 20% of the kids might be taught by one teacher somewhere remotely, and that might be effective and efficient for those students. So they're trying to crush this deliberately. So that struck me as really unfair to the students that thrive under those conditions and could go at their own pace and so forth. So distance learning, if it works, when distance learning works, it has a lot of advantages for the student, both the slow student and the fast student. The slow student can go over it and go over it and go over it, and can get, usually help from a tutor of some sort that the school provides. And the fast student can keep going instead of being held back by the classroom situation.
Mhm.
And in addition, of course, just what, a month ago and the previous year, the unions were saying the
Right.
only thing you could do is distance learning.
And not only that, de Blasio, the mayor of New York, promised that when they did reopen, he would have a distance learning option.
Mhm.
However, in a Fauci type flip flop, he's gone along, surprise, he's gone along with the unions.
Right.
I also was curious to notice that apparently the New York Times has been covering an internal dispute or even an internal kind of ideological war within the ACLU over the subject of free speech. I thought the ACLU was always for free speech, but apparently not so. What's the deal on that? Either of you know?
Well,
Well-
this was great reporting by Michael Powell of the New York Times,
Mhm.
and he interviewed both sides extensively. So the two sides are progressives who say the ACLU is a racial justice organization.
Mhm.
And the other side says it's a First Amendment, free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion association. And which is what it
Individual
was,
liberty.
which is what it was founded as. Now, it was founded by leftists, but it was founded by leftists who sincerely believed in individual liberty. And so this fight is happening. And the younger people, this is not uniform, but the tendency is that the younger people, the newer hires, are people that want cancel culture.
Mhm.
And the older people who think cancel culture is a violation of free speech. And one of the obvious areas that is interesting is that the ACLU is not defending students, including students in state universities where there's an obvious state interest involved, who are having their speech repressed. Whereas in the olden days, the ACLU was defending Nazis marching in Skokie and various other unpopular people.
Mhm.
But despite that, they were upholding freedom of speech and of the press and so forth. So this is a big war for the campuses. A new group called FIRE has come into existence.
Mhm.
Also, Harmeet Dillon has a group that does a lot of campus defense. She's a San Francisco attorney. There are other groups that work on this, but the ACLU is having a serious civil war within
And
its
it's
own
also on
ranks.
it's been also a fight on their board now for a number of years. One of our
Yeah.
advisory board members, Wendy Kaminer, quit
Yeah.
over this issue.
Wow.
So if you look in their annual report, it's on and on of all the stuff that they fought Trump on. And there's nothing about the First Amendment in their annual report.
That's right.
And I
Well, I
thought they
think
were all
fundamentally it's another example of the problem with progressivism, because progressivism doesn't believe in property rights and doesn't believe in individual empowerment in many respects. It's really rooted in sort of a collectivist ideology. And so as a
Mhm.
result, if push comes to shove, you're going to side with collectivism. And that's what the younger types are doing. And you can't have it both ways.
Well, the ACLU is going to have to choose because the road diverges.
Yep, that's
And
right.
paths
I thought
lead in-
another thing that we should give the New York Times credit for is that when Vice President Harris went to Guatemala, she's just been there, they ran a front page story on U.S. foreign aid to Central America and specifically to Guatemala,
Mhm.
in which they went in on the ground, they went to villages, they talked to villagers, they also talked to experts, and they said U.S. foreign aid is not leading to development in Central America or in Guatemala. It's lining the pockets of the elite in that country. It's lining the pockets of Beltway bandits, which is the nickname for people who specialize in taking federal contracts and executing them, situated around the Beltway, the highway that runs around Washington, D.C. So these are the people who walk off with the money. It's not like a commercial investment where somebody hopes to make a profit by serving people and giving them products. These are programs that are handouts and subsidies.
Now,
And
Vice
they
President,
don't lead to prosperity. She went to Guatemala to shower more foreign aid on these areas and thinking that somehow that's going to change things. And this New York Times story honestly said, and it was very, commendable that they said this. It has not diminished refugee flow, migrant flow. It has not.
When Vice President Harris has said that she wants to address the root causes behind, the mass migration up to El Norte, it has an element of truth to it. After all, people are sometimes desperate, certainly poor, and are politically oppressed in their home countries. It kind of makes sense to, solve the problem at its source. But what doesn't make sense is how she then would operationalize her insight about root causes, as if somehow aid transfers are the same thing as addressing root causes.
She also was claiming that it's all because of global warming, climate change.
Right.
And this goes back to another one of our friends, Peter Bauer, the economist from London, and he basically showed that in addition to the cronyism of foreign aid that Bill's referring to, what foreign aid does is that it destroys local businesses because people get goods and services for free, filtered through the bureaucracy of that corrupt government, and it destroys local businesses. And so a farmer can't sell his product because people are getting grain for free.
Right.
And so the economy is in the tank and continues to be, or goes even lower, and then people migrate. So
this
whole
story,
foreign aid,
in the New York Times,
it's like aid to cities. It's like all sorts of welfare state policies. The Biden crowd is trying to claim that extended high unemployment benefits do not incent people not to work. It has nothing to do with their not working. I mean,
that's laughable.
It's laughable.
So this New York Times story, again, commendably said that the areas that had the most foreign aid in Guatemala had the lesser amount of development, economic prosperity.
Of course, it's just logical.
They were empirically fulfilling the hypothesis advanced by Peter Bauer.
Exactly, that's right. And this is the big difference between Peter Bauer, say, and someone like Jeffrey Sachs, who's a big apologist for foreign aid and urban central planning in developing countries.
Because a lot of U.S. foreign aid, like some of the domestic aid that you were mentioning, David, does have that. In fact, let's hope it's an unintended consequence, but it has the consequence of enfeebling private initiative and calcifying the central state and its cronies, which therefore leads to a weakening of individual economic initiative, weakening of the sense of private property being sacrosanct, and therefore greater impoverishment. I would like to see a U.S. president, U.S. vice president, let's say in this case, going to Central and South America, advocating for and linking arms with those who support reform in those countries, political and economic reform to reinforce property rights and a marketplace that actually works.
And reduce corruption and reduce political decision-making that stands in the way of freedom of commerce and freedom of contract.
But if an American vice president stands for the proposition that there should be less freedom of contract and more central decision-making, you're not going to get that kind of reform initiative, are you?
No.
One of our senior fellows is an economist by the name of George Ayiti, who is at American University. And he has written a number of books.
And he's from Ghana. He's from Ghana, and he differentiates in Africa, which is the major area he did his research in, between those people who are the producers versus the predators. And so he has some pretty colorful language about what he calls the different sides in these situations.
You want to tell them what it is?
No, I'm not sure it's ready for family time.
Well, it's not that bad. It's basically making the simple point that wealth production requires a rule of law and property rights and the freedom to make and create products and trade with other people versus conquering people and seizing their wealth and either redistributing to themselves or wasting it or giving it to interest.
But George has some incredibly funny nicknames.
Yes.
Anyway, there's so much else going on, and we have to remember we do want to say at least something about the UFOs since you responded. at the
Oh, yeah,
beginning.
let's come to that
But-
at the end.
Okay, but a couple things that I thought were pretty interesting was California providing an option for prospective teachers who can't pass an 8th grade competency test. So instead of having to pass this as a prerequisite for becoming a public school teacher, they're going to have workarounds, they're going to have options, they're going to look to other things. If you can't pass an 8th grade competency test, what are you doing in this classroom and what are taxpayers paying for? They're paying for the reduction of student learning, if that's what the kind of teacher. If you get 3 bad teachers in a row, this is a proven fact in education science. You are wrecked for life.
Well, what's the reason behind it? Could it be that we shouldn't
It's-
shame these teachers because
Yeah.
after all, they've earned their credential and we shouldn't
Yeah.
put them through a
Yeah,
shaming process?
they shouldn't be ashamed of not knowing what they're supposed to know. And it may be, the Armenians are doing better than the Azerbaijanis on this test.
Well, it's another example of, again, getting back to Adam Smith, of creating a cartel. So you have a labor cartel, and the cartel controls the provision of teachers to the local schools,
All right.
and it's policed by the government. And they do everything they can to eliminate their competition.
Well, actually, this is an interesting twist on all this, because the test actually fosters a cartel in a sense, because it's reducing the number of people who can become teachers.
Well, that's what
Ide-
occupational licensing
Ideally,
is.
ideally, we wouldn't even want this test. What we would want is them to fire the incompetent teachers, but that's impossible politically. So this is a second best, third best, fifth best thing, is to at least have a hurdle that they have to go through before they're locked in and we can never fire them.
Now, what I'm saying, Bill, is the fact they
I
don't want
understand.
the test is to protect the cartel. Because then
Right.
the
It's
public
more to get-
obviously wants competent teachers,
Right.
and they're shielding people from access to that.
So another horrible thing was this front page leak in all the papers about tax information.
I can hardly believe that the private information from people's personal IRS files has been released. ProPublica originally released it and then it went viral. And some people are saying, oh, well, Bezos and Buffett and so forth, they don't deserve privacy for their tax returns. I don't know that I admire those men entirely, but if they don't get privacy for their tax returns, am I going to have privacy for my tax returns?
Right. I mean, they have, rooms, fleets of lawyers. The average person does not. So if these people can't have their tax records, their financial privacy protected, then nobody can.
And, this is also a case, people laugh off the idea of a deep state or a bureaucracy that has political goals and tendencies and vetoes things and uses choke points and uses bureaucratic maneuvering in order to get its way for the policy that they would prefer.
Mhm.
Well, somebody leaked all these. There's only 2 ways it could get out. Somebody on the inside leaking it out,
Mhm.
or somebody hacking it, meaning they have inadequate protections.
Mhm.
Either way, it is, here's the IRS where we had deliberate attacking of conservative organizations during the Obama era. And, here's the president trying to incredibly increase taxes. And suddenly all this information that can be used in the narrative to support the president's agenda just happens to be leaked.
Yep.
It's very ugly when you don't have a more neutral bureaucracy than
It's
we seem
frightening.
to have.
Mhm.
That's right. It's also an argument against having the government have this kind of tax power in the first place.
Right. And,
Mhm.
and an income tax lends itself to this in a way that other
Right.
taxes don't.
America's founders would not have looked kindly on the idea of having an income tax. And of course, the way the tax is set up is that you're double taxed with both corporate and individual taxes. But
Right.
I think a lot of liberals that rightfully have been concerned about the USA Patriot Act seem to turn a blind eye to the powers the IRS has.
Yes, I don't understand why the one is not just as troubling as the other. I really don't understand. And I also, I'm disturbed by the reaction of many people who say, well, yeah, they probably shouldn't have leaked that stuff or hacked it, but these guys, but
Right.
it was
And-
good.
and as-
It's good the law was broken because these guys are breaking the law.
By
As
the
Bill-
way, at least the Biden administration said they were going to vigorously pursue what
Right.
happened here.
Go
Yes.
for it. That's
And
what I
as
say.
Bill rightfully's pointed out, there's, to believe this is a coincidence when they're talking about getting people to pay their fair share. I don't.
And when
is-
Biden is developing whole fleets of additional investigators
Right,
to go after the rich,
yes.
all right, it's not a coincidence.
Well, and the other part of this is that the rich do not have enough wealth to pay for what Biden wants to fund. So it'll be a mass tax.
On the middle class. There's
Right,
no doubt. There's
exactly.
not enough money to ridding out of the rich.
That's right.
Well, but hey, maybe the aliens are going to come on UFOs and deliver us from all these problems. What do you think? Yeah, UFOs are all the rage now, aren't they? What do you guys think about that? Are you persuaded, or should we have an open mind that maybe these are from other universes or galaxies?
I think, first of all, the Independent Institute welcomes. Just kidding. I don't think we have an official position on this, but we can still, as individuals, comment on what we think. David, you had some thoughts on this, I know.
Well, I mean, the likelihood is that this is not extraterrestrial activity. I mean, the surveillance systems that exist globally that track foreign bodies are quite extensive, and there's no way even.
So foreign bodies meaning things coming from outer space.
That's right. And so if something came from outer space, we would know it.
Right.
Second is all these different objects are traveling in the atmosphere, which means they are not intergalactic. They have to have air to be able to move. So the possibility of there being other kinds of crafts that have been developed secretly in some way by other governments or even privately is certainly possible. Maybe the US government is doing it and trying to cover themselves. Who knows? But the point is that there is zero evidence that there are any extraterrestrial crafts that have ever been on Earth or around Earth.
Exactly.
And so
I agree.
the hoopla about, and this goes back to a bigger point about the nature of a lot of NASA research and so forth, is the ambition of a lot of these projects to go to Mars or to go to one of the moons of Jupiter or whatever, to find water and so on, is to prove that life can essentially originate spontaneously in places other than the Earth. Now, maybe that's possible, but it's really a metaphysical question when it comes down to a lot of the motivation for this. So what I'm saying is that there's a huge amount of attention and tax-funded projects which are really religious crusades,
Mhm.
and a lot of the hoopla about the UFOs seems to fall into that category.
A lot of these specific videos, like the Navy ones, they're called Go Fast, FLIR, Gimbal, and
Mhm.
so forth, have been analyzed. And notwithstanding what you may hear on cable TV, most of them can well be explained in different ways. Oftentimes, for example, these things might have been, as I have read, a seabird or a balloon distorted by the optical phenomenon of a parallax,
Yes.
which is an effect that makes an object that's close to an observer filmed against a distant background seem to speed up.
Yeah. Right.
There are many explanations without going to the other galaxies. So I think we'll set that one to bed and feel a little bit more secure tonight. We've covered a lot of territory today. Thank you very much, David Theroux, Bill Evers. I appreciate your incisive, look at these issues. We thank all of our friends who've joined us through ThinkSpot and elsewhere. And we will be back in a couple of weeks and see what's next to look at from an independent outlook. Okay, thanks, David
Thank you.
and Bill.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next